The afternoon Sandra Pelham climbed through the gap in my eastern fence line, where the creek crossing made the wire difficult to maintain at standard tension, and walked 30 feet into my south pasture before my trail camera alert reached my phone. I was in the equipment barn 200 yards away running the annual service on my hay baler. And I want to tell you that my first response was not alarm and not amusement, but the specific professional assessment of someone who has managed cattle operations for 29 years and who understood in the first 2 seconds of looking at the camera image exactly what the combination of factors in that pasture at that moment was likely to produce and what the liability and documentation implications of that production would be. My name is Cora Wheatley. I am 53 years old, a licensed agricultural operator and certified livestock manager with 29 years of experience in beef cattle production, pasture management, and working farm operations in central Tennessee. And I have owned the Wheatley family farm on 218 acres for the entirety of my adult professional life. My late husband Raymond built most of the infrastructure I maintain today and trained me in every aspect of the operation before his death 8 years ago, after which I had continued the operation alone with 2 full-time hands named Burl and Marcus, and the specific determination of someone who understood that quitting would dishonor both the land and the man who had loved it. The south pasture on the afternoon Sandra Pelham entered. It contained 41 cow-calf pairs in the early summer grazing rotation and 1 Charolais bull named Henry who weighed 2,060 pounds and who had been in that pasture for 11 days as part of the breeding rotation, and who had during those 11 days established the specific territorial awareness that breeding bulls establish when they are in a pasture with cows they are responsible for. Which is to say, he was attentive to the perimeter of the pasture in a way that he was not attentive to it during non-breeding periods. The fence gap where Sandra had entered was on the eastern boundary, approximately 280 feet from where Henry was grazing when the camera showed her crossing through the wire. The prevailing wind that afternoon was from the west, which meant her scent would reach Henry before she came into his visual field. I noted this while I was still looking at the camera image on my phone in the equipment barn. I set down the grease gun. I picked up my radio. I called Marcus, who was in the north field, and told him there was a person in the south pasture near the eastern fence and that Henry was in that pasture on breeding rotation and that I needed him to come to the south pasture gate immediately from the roadside. Then I walked toward the south pasture at the pace that experienced cattle managers use when they need to move quickly without causing more agitation than the situation already contained. I want to explain something about cattle behavior that is essential to understanding what happened next and what did not happen. A breeding bull in a pasture with cows is not a uniformly aggressive animal. He is a territorial animal with specific threat assessment behaviors that are triggered by specific stimuli. An unfamiliar scent entering the pasture perimeter from the downwind side is one of those stimuli. The response to that stimulus is investigative approach, which looks from a distance like a charge, but is in the first phase a movement toward the stimulus to assess it, during which the bull's body language communicates his assessment and his intent. Henry moved toward Sandra's position from the west at a pace that was faster than his normal grazing movement. Sandra, who had been walking toward a fence line she appeared to have been photographing based on the angle of her phone, became aware of Henry's movement when he was approximately 90 feet from her. From 90 feet, a 2,000-pound bull moving at a trot toward you in an open pasture presents a visual experience that I understand produces a strong response in people who have not been around cattle their entire lives. Sandra ran. Running from a moving large animal in a pasture activates the pursuit response that the investigative approach had not yet activated. Henry, whose behavior shifted from investigative to responsive when Sandra ran, accelerated. Sandra reached the fence gap she had entered through and pushed through the wire at a speed that left a piece of her jacket sleeve on the barb and deposited her on the other side of the fence approximately 4 seconds before Henry reached the fence line. Henry stopped at the fence, assessed the situation, found the exterior now uninhabited, and after approximately 45 seconds of monitoring, the fence line turned and walked back toward the herd. I arrived at the south pasture gate from the interior side 90 seconds after Sandra cleared the fence. Marcus arrived from the roadside at approximately the same moment. Sandra was standing on the exterior of the fence, 30 feet from the gap she had entered through. She was breathing hard. Her jacket was torn at the left sleeve. She had a scratch on her left forearm from the barbed wire. She appeared otherwise uninjured. I assessed her condition from the gate. She appeared uninjured beyond the scratch and the jacket. I opened the gate from the interior, stepped through, closed it behind me, and walked toward her. Marcus positioned himself at the gap in the fence where she had entered to prevent any cattle following. I said, "Are you injured?" She said, "That bull almost killed me." I said Henry was performing his standard perimeter response to an unfamiliar stimulus entering the pasture. He stopped at the fence. "Are you injured beyond the scratch on your arm?" She said, "I could have been killed." I said, "You entered a working cattle pasture without permission through a known gap in the fence that is posted. I need to know if you require medical attention." She looked at her arm. The scratch was superficial, a single barb contact, not deep. She said, "It is just a scratch." I said, "I am going to ask you to come with me to the farm office and tell me what you were doing in that pasture." She said, "I was documenting a fence violation." I said, "Whose fence violation?" She said, "Yours. The fence along the eastern boundary is below the minimum height required by the County Agricultural Fencing Code." I said, "Come to the farm office." In the farm office, I had Sandra sit while I photographed her arm scratch, the tear in her jacket, and her general state. I did this before anything else because documentation is the first step, and I had been doing it first for 29 years. Then I offered her water, and she accepted it, and we sat across from each other at the farm table. I said, "Your name?" She said, "Sandra Pelham. I live in the Maplewood Creek development adjacent to your eastern boundary." I had known who Sandra Pelham was for 14 months. She was 60 years old, a retired regulatory compliance officer from Nashville who had moved to Maplewood Creek 18 months ago and who had been the HOA board president for 14 of those months. She had filed 4 complaints with the County Agricultural Commissioner's office about my operation during those 14 months. All 4 had been reviewed and closed without finding. She had attended 2 county commissioner meetings and raised concerns about agricultural operations adjacent to residential developments. She had sent me 3 written notices on HOA letterhead, asserting that various aspects of my operation were in violation of unspecified community standards. Notices that had been reviewed by my farm attorney James Waller and found to have no legal foundation given that my property predated the development and was covered by an agricultural operations disclosure in Maplewood Creek's own CC and RS. I said, "Sandra, I know who you are. I have documentation of our prior interactions going back 14 months. What I need to understand is what brought you onto my property today." She said, "The fence along the eastern boundary is below the minimum height required by the County Agricultural Fencing Code. I was documenting the violation to support a complaint." I said, "The County Agricultural Fencing Code minimum height for livestock containment is 48 inches for cattle operations. My eastern boundary fence averages 54 inches with a low point of 46 inches at the creek crossing where the terrain makes standard tension difficult to maintain. I have documentation of the fence measurements from my last annual inspection 3 weeks ago." She said, "The creek crossing section is below the minimum." I said, "The creek crossing section is at 46 inches due to terrain constraints that are recognized in the county code's variance provisions for watercourse crossings. I have the variance documentation on file." She said, "I did not know about the variance." I said, "The variance is on file with the County Agricultural Commissioner, the same office where you filed your 4 prior complaints. Any of those complaint investigations would have surfaced the variance if the fence height had been part of the complaint. You entered my property to document a violation that does not exist." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her scratched arm. She said, "I did not expect there to be a bull in that pasture." I said, "The south pasture is part of my active cattle operation. I have 41 cow-calf pairs and one breeding bull in rotation through that pasture during this period of the breeding season. Every gate and access point on the southern boundary has posted warning signs. The creek crossing gap has a posted warning sign that I replaced 3 weeks ago." She said, "I did not see a sign." I said, "I have a photograph of the sign in place from 3 weeks ago, and my trail camera has footage of your entry point from today that shows the sign post is visible in the frame." She said, "I should have read the sign." I said, "Yes." She said, "Is the bull dangerous?" I said, "Henry is a working breeding bull. He is not aggressive under normal conditions. He responded to your presence in a standard perimeter investigation pattern. You ran, which activated a pursuit response. He stopped at the fence because the fence is the boundary of his territory and you were no longer inside it. You were not in danger of serious injury if you had remained still and allowed me to reach you before he reached the fence." She said, "I did not know that." I said, "That is the central reason why working cattle operations post warning signs and why entering them without permission and without agricultural experience is dangerous. Not because the cattle are uniformly aggressive, but because people without agricultural experience make decisions in response to cattle behavior that escalate situations that would otherwise resolve safely." She was quiet again. Then she said, "What happens now?" I said, "I'm going to call James Waller, my farm attorney, and describe today's incident. I'm also going to file a formal report with the county sheriff's department documenting the trespass. The scratch on your arm is a documented injury sustained during an unauthorized entry onto my property. Whether you pursue a workers' compensation type claim or any other claim related to today is between you and your attorney, but I want the official record to accurately reflect the circumstances." She said, "You are going to file a trespass report." I said, "Yes. You entered my property through a fence gap without permission. That is trespass under Tennessee law regardless of your reason for entering." She said, "I was trying to document a fence violation for the community's protection." I said, "You were trying to document what you believed was a violation. The violation does not exist. The trespass does." She left after I gave her the first aid materials for her scratch, and she had cleaned and bandaged it. I called James from the farm office. James said, "She entered the south pasture." I said, "Through the creek crossing gap. Henry was on breeding rotation in that pasture." He said, "Was anyone hurt?" I said, "She has a superficial barbed wire scratch from exiting through the fence. No other injuries." He said, "What was she doing there?" I said, documenting what she believed was a fence height violation. "The violation does not exist. I have the variance documentation." He said, "I know you have the variance documentation. You filed it in response to the second county complaint 14 months ago." I said, "She did not know about it." He said, "She filed 4 complaints with the office that has it on file." I said, "None of her complaints addressed fence height. The variance would not have appeared in those investigations." James said, "She entered a working cattle pasture to document a violation that does not exist and encountered a breeding bull on rotation." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How is Henry?" I said, "He is fine. He investigated, she ran, he pursued to the fence line, she cleared the fence, he stopped. Normal behavior sequence. He went back to the herd within a minute." James said, "The camera footage shows all of this." I said, "Every moment from her entry, through her clearance of the fence and Henry's return to the herd." He said, "I want to file a comprehensive response to the full 14 months of Sandra Pelham's conduct today. The trespass gives us the anchor event and the 4 prior complaints, and the 3 unauthorized notices give us the pattern. I also want to contact the County Agricultural Commissioner directly about the fence violation claim, because she apparently intends to file a 5th complaint based on what she was documenting." I said, "The variance is on file." He said, I know I want the commissioner to have a direct briefing from me about the pattern of complaints before a fifth one arrives so that it is reviewed in context. I said, contact the commissioner, file the documentation. I will send you everything from today within the hour. I sent James everything within the hour. The trail camera footage, the farm office photographs of Sandra's scratch and jacket, the fence measurement records from 3 weeks ago, including the creek crossing section, the variance documentation, the prior complaint records, and a written timeline of the 14-month interaction history, with every entry documented by date, type, and outcome. James filed the formal trespass complaint with the county sheriff's department and began building the civil harassment claim against Sandra and against the Maplewood Creek HOA on the theory that Sandra's conduct had been undertaken in her capacity as board president, and that the pattern of complaints and unauthorized notices constituted a coordinated campaign against my agricultural operation. The county agricultural commissioner, a man named Dale Simmons, who had held the position for 18 years and who I had worked with productively on several prior matters, received James's briefing about the pattern of complaints the following morning. Dale called me that afternoon. He said, I reviewed our file on your property after James called. The variance for the creek crossing is properly documented and has been on file for 9 years. None of Ms. Pelham's 4 prior complaints addressed fence height, and none of the investigations would have surfaced the variance because it was not relevant to the complaint subjects. I said she entered my south pasture to document a violation that has a variance on file. He said yes, and when she files a 5th complaint, I will review it in the context of the full file, including the variance and the prior 4 closed complaints. I said, thank you, Dale. He said, Cora, I want to say something. I said, say it. He said, I have been the agricultural commissioner in this county for 18 years. In those 18 years, I have seen residential developments built adjacent to agricultural operations dozens of times. The first 2 years after a development goes in are usually difficult. Complaints, noise concerns, odor concerns, the full range. Most of them resolve as the new residents develop realistic expectations about agricultural adjacency. I said, most of them. He said some do not. When they do not, it is usually because someone in the development decides the agricultural operation is the problem to be solved rather than a fact of the landscape to be accommodated. When that happens, things tend to escalate until something significant occurs. I said, something significant occurred yesterday. He said, yes. She entered your south pasture and encountered Henry. She was not seriously injured, which I am genuinely glad about, but she understood after the encounter that your farm is a working agricultural operation with real consequences for unauthorized entry. That understanding may do more to resolve the situation than anything else has. I said, I hope you are right. He said, either way, the documentation is good and the legal record is solid, and James knows what he is doing. The civil claim James filed covered the full 14 months. 4 county complaints closed without finding, 3 unauthorized HOA notices with no legal foundation, the trespass and resulting injury documentation, James's fees for the full period of responding to the pattern, compensatory damages for the sustained interference with my agricultural operation, and something James called agricultural harassment damages, which he explained was a theory available under Tennessee's Right to Farm Act for sustained patterns of complaint and interference targeting an established agricultural operation without factual foundation. Sandra retained an attorney named Philip Cross, who I recognized from other accounts in this collection and who apparently practiced in this county as well as others. Philip called James within 2 weeks. He had reviewed the claim and the documentation, and he said, your client has 9 years of variance documentation for the creek crossing fence section and 4 closed complaint records showing a pattern. James said, and trail camera footage of the trespass incident and the agricultural response and documentation of a sustained 14-month pattern of unfounded complaints. Philip said, my client entered the property with the genuine belief that there was a fence violation. James said the genuine belief was incorrect. The county file that would have corrected it was accessible at the same office where she had filed 4 prior complaints, and she entered a working cattle pasture without permission rather than filing a complaint through the available administrative channel. Philip said she sustained an injury. James said a superficial barbed wire scratch sustained while trespassing. My client has photographs of the injury, which is consistent with a barbed wire exit at speed and documentation of the warning sign at the entry point. Philip said, my client is prepared to resolve this. The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks. The Maplewood Creek HOA's insurance carrier was involved because the HOA board theory of James's claim created institutional liability. The carrier had reviewed the claim and the documentation and had apparently reached a view similar to the county commissioner's assessment, which was that a pattern of 14 months of unfounded complaints followed by a trespass incident was not the kind of thing insurance carriers preferred to litigate. The final settlement was $38,000. The HOA's insurance covered $22,000. Sandra paid $16,000 personally. The personal portion covered the trespass damages and the agricultural harassment damages that were specific to her individual conduct as distinct from the HOA's institutional involvement. The settlement also included 3 non-monetary conditions. First, Sandra's resignation from the HOA board, which she submitted the week after the settlement was executed. Second, a formal board resolution acknowledging the agricultural operations disclosure in Maplewood Creek's CC and RS, and committing the board to reviewing that disclosure and its implications for adjacent property interactions before filing future complaints or notices. Third, a board letter to all Maplewood Creek residents explaining that the adjacent Wheatley Farm was an established agricultural operation operating under Tennessee's Right to Farm Act, and that the CC and RS included an agricultural operations disclosure acknowledging this. The letter to residents was the condition I had suggested specifically because I believed the most effective long-term resolution was for Maplewood Creek residents to understand what the adjacent land was and what it meant to live adjacent to a working cattle farm, which was information that would have been useful to them before they bought their lots, and that was better late than never. The letter went out on HOA letterhead under the new board president, a retired farmer named Gerald Okafor who had bought into Maplewood Creek 3 years ago and who had told James privately that he had found the prior board's approach to the adjacent farm embarrassing and was glad the situation had been resolved. Henry remained in the south pasture for another 3 weeks before the breeding rotation moved him to the west section. He had returned to his normal routine within an hour of the incident and had shown no lasting behavioral effects from the encounter. He was a good bull with a predictable temperament, and he had done exactly what his breeding and his situation had required him to do, which was to investigate a perimeter intrusion and stop at the boundary when the intrusion cleared it. Burl came to the equipment barn the evening after the settlement was finalized and leaned against the doorframe while I was cleaning up from the baler service. I had interrupted the day of the incident and finally completed in the 2 weeks since. He said 38,000. I said yes. He said because she walked through the creek crossing. I said because of 14 months of unfounded complaints and 1 trespass that resulted in a documented injury and involved Henry. He said Henry just did what Henry does. I said Henry did exactly what Henry does. He investigated a perimeter intrusion and stopped at the fence. That is correct behavior. He said she ran. I said most people without agricultural experience run when a large animal moves toward them. He said Raymond always said the running was the problem. I said Raymond was right. If you stay still and let an experienced stock person reach you, the situation resolves safely almost every time. Running activates the pursuit response. He said she did not know that. I said no, she knew she was entering a working cattle operation. The sign said it. The gap in the fence said it. The gate at the road said it. What she did not know was the specific behavioral protocols that make it safe to be in a pasture with cattle. That is why people with agricultural experience post signs, because the signs say do not enter, and the reason not to enter is because you do not know what I know about how to be here safely. Burl said, 38,000 is a lot to pay for not reading a sign. I said 38,000 is what 14 months of unfounded complaints and one trespass cost when the person who did it found an agricultural operation that had been documenting everything since the first complaint arrived. He said Raymond would have liked the documentation habit. I said Raymond taught me the documentation habit. He said he taught you everything. I said he taught me everything, and I have been paying attention for 29 years. He went home. I finished the barn cleanup and walked the south pasture fence in the evening light, the same perimeter check I did every week. The creek crossing section was at 46 inches where the terrain made 48 difficult. The warning sign was on its post, legible orange text on white, the standard agricultural warning coloration. Henry was in the far corner with the herd, grazing, unconcerned with anything at the perimeter. Everything was as it had been for 29 years. The land was working correctly. The cattle were managed correctly. The documentation was current and complete. The legal record was solid. All of it had been true before Sandra Pelham climbed through the wire. All of it would be true after the settlement was paid and the board letter went out and the new president understood what the adjacent land was. The farm was what it had always been. The creek crossing was 46 inches where the terrain required it. The variance had been on file for 9 years. Henry was in the far corner doing what breeding bulls do in the evenings when the day's work is done. Everything was exactly as it should be. Thumbnail text, she snuck onto his farm to document a violation that didn't exist. The 2,060-pound bull knew the rules better than she did.